Have you ever tried to do the right thing, just to ease the guilt gnawing at your heart? Julian Carter, a real estate magnate, thought hiring a stranger, a quiet, unassuming nurse, might finally bring him the peace he craved. He never imagined that through her quiet kindness, she would lead him back to the wounds he had long buried, the ones he refused to name. And then, one evening, as a song drifted through the air, something within him began to shift. If there has ever been a moment in your life when you longed for forgiveness, perhaps this story is meant for you too. The conference room was so vast that every tap of a shoe against the marble floor echoed coldly through the air. Overhead, rows of stark white lights spilled down onto a long, black, leather-covered table where 12 men and women sat upright, their gazes fixed on the lone figure standing before the presentation screen, Julian Carter. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to pound his fist on the table. His mere presence compressed the air, as if every molecule understood instinctively that mistakes would not be tolerated. The dark suit molded perfectly to his tall, broad frame. The black tie cinched tightly, a silent reminder. Control. No. Leniency. No compromise. Julian conducted the meeting like a maestro leading a symphony. A slight nod, a fleeting glance, enough to make partners adjust their tone, their posture, even their breathing. On the screen, the growth charts glowed. Flawless. Numbers, graphs shooting upward like launched arrows. In the past year, Julian's company had acquired 6 major towers, seized 3 disputed plots, and eliminated 5 potential competitors. And yet, in that cold fluorescence, if one looked closely, they might have seen it. The emptiness behind. His rimless glasses, the hollowness of eyes like a dried-up well. The meeting ended with a quiet nod from Julian. No need for closing remarks. The others shuffled their papers and left in a hurried silence, like survivors slipping away from the eye of a storm. Julian did not move immediately. He stared at the blank screen, at the scattered raindrops clinging to the vast pane of glass, behind it. Outside, the world had turned a murky gray, a thin veil of mist draping over the city. He reached up and tugged at his tie, tightening it slightly. A small motion, yet it felt like wrapping another invisible chain around his throat. Few assistants lingered nervously in the hallway, waiting for a sign they could enter. Julian gave none. He hated having to repeat orders. He hated unnecessary noise. He walked slowly from the room, his long strides falling rhythmically on the cold stone, each footfall ticking like the precise, detached hands of a clock. The elevator doors slid open, casting a muted reflection of him in the dim lights. Julian stepped inside and pressed for the basement. He needed no bodyguards. Within these walls, every brick was under his dominion. The black Bentley awaited him. The driver hurried to open the door, but Julian shook his head slightly and slipped into the back seat himself, pulling the door shut with barely a sound. On the drive home, the skyscrapers outside blurred into smudges of light against the fine drizzle. Julian leaned back, closing his eyes. For a moment, weariness seeped into the carved planes of his face, the exhaustion of a man who had conquered everything except himself. Rain tapped softly against the car windows. Julian left the radio off. He couldn't bear the clutter of music tonight. He needed the silence, the emptiness, the total control even over sound. Then, without warning, a prickling at his throat. The tie that had been his armor all day now felt like a noose. He tugged at it, loosening the knot, but the tightness lingered, stubborn and choking. Like a child who had tied something too tightly and forgotten how to undo it. At a red light, Julian opened his eyes. Through the misted glass, he saw an elderly couple huddled beneath a small umbrella, hands clasped tightly together. A simple, ordinary gesture, but it struck something hollow deep in his chest. He turned his face away as if affronted by the sight. In Julian Carter's world, emotions were a luxury. He had long since discarded them, or so he told himself. Day after day, the car turned onto a quiet street lined with old trees leading to his secluded mansion. The driver stepped out silently to open the door. Julian emerged, drawing a long breath of the damp, cool air. The grand house loomed, light bleeding weakly from a few small windows. He walked inside, letting the automatic door seal the world out behind him. In the living room, a vase of carefully arranged flowers stood by a steaming cup of tea. Prepared. Like clockwork, everything was immaculate, on time, by the book. But immaculate did not mean warm. Julian removed his watch, setting it lightly on the glass table. His hand trembled, whether from rain or something else he couldn't say. He slipped off his tie, letting it fall to the floor like a black smear on the pale stone. He stared at it for a long moment. A knot, a symbol of control, a voluntary shackle. He moved toward his study, footsteps muffled by thick carpet. Stacks of documents waited on the desk, expansion plans, PR campaigns, profit reports. Every figure, a testament to his victories, but in the dark, those victories felt as cold as the stone beneath his fingertips. Julian opened his laptop. The bluish light cast ghostly shadows across his face. Instead of pulling up a report, he opened a search bar. Not to look up a competitor, not a new market, just searching for something, anything. His fingers hovered, then typed, hesitated, finally resting on the words. How to apologize when you can't turn back time. The screen offered no real answers, no miracles, no shortcuts. Only the blinking cursor, reflecting in eyes too exhausted even to summon tears. Julian leaned back, eyes closed, whispering as if to no one at all. If I just control everything, there won't be mistakes. Right, outside, the rain kept falling, steady and unrelenting. The Bentley slid smoothly through streets bathed in a pale golden glow. Julian leaned his forehead against the cold glass, watching raindrops slither across the window like tiny, aimless rivers. A gust of wind rattled the car door, sending up a spray of water from the slick streets. The streetlights wavered like dying flames, flickering through the blurry veil of rain. At a red light, the car jerked to a halt, and in that moment, something inside Julian, something long locked, away, creaked open like a door untouched for years. Rain. A night just like this one. A night heavy with mist, when everything blurred at the edges of dream and reality. He remembered it. Every detail. Julian had gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles blanched under the harsh interior lights. His breathing came fast and shallow, his chest constricted beneath a damp shirt clinging to his skin. He had just walked out of a grueling, suffocating 7-hour negotiation, one that had drained the very air from his lungs. That night, he had chosen to drive alone. No driver, no security detail, partly to reclaim some shred of control, partly to purge the boiling restlessness inside him. The sudden rainstorm had been the final drop in a cup already filled to the brim. The streetlights smeared broken streaks of light across the slick pavement. He turned into a quiet residential neighborhood where the sparse glow of windows only deepened the surrounding darkness. And then, from an unmarked intersection, a bicycle darted out. Fragile. Soaked in rain. Everything happened in a flash. Julian slammed on the brakes, foot stomping down with the desperate force of a man trying to stop time itself. The screech of tires tore through the night, sharp and piercing. But the car didn't stop in time. The collision was soft. No grinding metal, no shattering glass. Just a sickening, muted thud, like something weightless being flung aside. The bicycle spun once in the air before crashing to the ground. The boy, barely 18 or 19, crumpled, his head striking the curb with a dull, bone-deep crack. Julian froze. He couldn't remember stepping out of the car, couldn't remember running to the boy. Only the raw sensation of kneeling. Beside him, the rain slashing down, stitching icy needles into their skin. The boy lay motionless, eyes half closed. A thin stream of crimson pooled around him, staining the slick pavement. His soaked shirt clung to his frail frame, trembling with the shallow, broken rhythm of his breaths. Julian's hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. His voice, when it finally emerged, was hoarse, strangled. Accident. Ambulance. Hurry. Lights flickered on in nearby houses. Doors creaked open. Barefoot steps slapped against the wet ground. A woman burst from a house, wild-eyed, hair in disarray, a flimsy nightgown clinging to her shivering frame. When her gaze landed on the boy, Julian heard it. The scream that didn't quite make. It passed her throat, choking her instead. She collapsed beside her son, hands trembling as they skimmed frantically over his face, his hair, whispering meaningless words. Julian stumbled back. One step, two. Standing there, helpless, like a child who had shattered something and could not put it back together. The Bentley's windshield was now a mirror, reflecting a man who was supposed to be powerful, composed, reduced to something small and useless. Against the raw, naked grief before him, the ambulance came. The police followed. They asked questions about his speed, the weather, his reflexes. Julian answered mechanically, detached. He hadn't been drinking. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't meant for any of it to happen. But none of it made a difference. Against the knot of guilt tightening in his chest, the boy disappeared behind the ambulance doors with a final, hollow slam. The mother, barely able to stand, was supported by a female officer. Her gaze, wild, shattered yet strangely resigned, swept over Julian. In that moment, Julian understood. That look would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Bentley rolled down the midnight streets, pulling him from the memory's grip. He blinked. A long, thin trail of condensation streaked the glass beside him, like a tear someone had forgotten to wipe away. His fingers dug into the leather seat, nails leaving deep crescents in his palm. "I was there," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of it. "I saw, and I couldn't do anything." Outside, the rain kept falling, a low, mournful chorus washing over the glistening streets. But inside Julian, the rain would never stop. The kitchen light cast a pale glow across the cold tile floor, stretching out into lonely streaks on the empty ground. Julian stood motionless at the sink, his hands braced against the marble counter, head bowed low as if the weight of memory was too much for his shoulders to bear. He had dreamed again. The same nightmare, the bicycle spinning through the air, the mother's stunned, broken gaze, the silent helplessness that swallowed him whole. There was no way to extinguish. It, No way to rewrite the ending. The steady ticking of the wall clock echoed through the stillness, marking the slow, stubborn passage of a night that refused to end. Part of him wanted to give in, to slide down onto the floor and let it all shatter around him. But habit, control, pride, those old, hardened layers, still gripped him tight like concrete poured around a failing heart. He turned on the kitchen light. The glow spilled outward, but it did nothing to push back the darkness gnawing at him from within. Julian opened a cabinet, pulled down a white porcelain mug, and filled it with thick black coffee from the thermos. The bitter scent unfurled into the air, sharp and heavy. He clutched the mug with both hands, fingers tightening around the cold ceramic, seeking some small anchor in the night. He sat at the massive dining table, facing nothing but space. A table meant for 6. Too wide, too empty for just one. Man! Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the windows, clinging to the glass like memories that refused to wash away. Julian lifted the mug to his lips, taking a small, scalding sip. The coffee bit at his tongue, harsh and unkind, but it reminded him he was still alive, in some sense of the word. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Unfinished projects, unsigned deals, relentless negotiations. A machine he had built himself and now couldn't climb out of. He glanced at his phone lying on the table. Notifications stacked up. Emails from partners, texts from his secretary, reminders for meetings. An entire world spinning smoothly, where Julian Carter sat firmly at the center. Yet behind the gleaming machinery of it all, he knew he was quietly, steadily coming apart. No one knew. No one was allowed to know, not even himself. He rose, leaving the half-finished coffee steaming listlessly on the table. As he walked down the long corridor toward his study, Julian felt as though he were drifting through a vacuum. Each step echoed against the cold. Stone floor, a hollow drumbeat of the solitude he had meticulously constructed. The study blazed with LED lights. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed the dark, restless outlines of trees outside, their skeletal limbs swaying like ghostly arms in the mist. Julian sank into his chair and opened his laptop. Files blinked into view, endless rows of them. Q4 expansion plan, Midtown bid report, office chain acquisition strategy, meticulous plans, successful campaigns, flawless statistics. He clicked through them mechanically, eyes scanning, mind absent. He knew, if he just kept working, kept conquering, kept signing new deals, he could outrun the image of the boy. Crumpled on the rain-slick curb, he could drown out the soundless scream of the mother. He could forget the eyes that had damned him without a single word. But deep down, Julian understood. This was a race he would never win. The bluish light from the laptop screen illuminated the lines etched deep around his eyes. Too heavy. For a man still young, he typed out a swift email, approved a proposal, authorized another expansion. Every action precise, seamless, as if by controlling everything outside him, he could somehow quell the chaos within. But the truth was simpler, crueler. He was only patching empty spaces with hollow victories. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. Julian reached for it, then thought better of it, setting it back down with a quiet clink. He stared into the dark pool of liquid, seeing nothing but the reflection of his own emptiness. Outside, the rain whispered on. A gust of wind rattled the branches against the glass like long, bony fingers tapping out a mournful rhythm. Julian propped his chin on his hand and closed his eyes for a fleeting moment. He could feel himself drifting, slipping out of reality, melting into the sound of the rain and the faint hum of the screen. He had won every game out there. He had commanded people, situations, entire empires. He had reached heights others only dreamed of. But sitting here in the cold hush of the night, face to face with his own reflection, Julian saw the brutal truth. He had won everything, except himself. Morning draped a thin veil of mist across the high windows, the light falling quietly onto the cold stone floor, too pale to warm the vastness of the conference room. Julian sat at the head of the table, a glossy list of names in hand, his eyes moving absently over each line. The internal recruitment meeting dragged on, voices weaving in and out of his consciousness like a faint, tuneless hum. No one dared interrupt the flow of Julian Carter's thoughts. A young secretary stood nearby, carefully presenting candidates for a special care position. A relatively simple role, but one requiring absolute trust. Julian flipped to the next page. Neat rows of text, crisp resumes, cold statistics measuring skills and years of experience. Then his hand froze. Isla Bennett. Her name printed at the top. Plain, unembellished, unapologetically real. A name that should have meant nothing, and yet it struck something buried deep within him, slicing clean through the walls he had so carefully built. Bennett, the name he'd heard when the police asked him questions that night. The name the boy's mother had screamed, broken, frantic, drowning in grief. The name that had carved itself into his memory like a wound that refused to close. Julian lifted his head, masking the slight tremor behind the familiar steel of his gaze. "Isla Bennett," the secretary announced, unaware of the subtle shift in her boss's demeanor. Nursing graduate, currently working part-time while caring for her brother, who's in a vegetative state. Strong references. She's requesting flexible hours. A heartbeat faltered inside Julian. He leaned back, seeming almost indifferent, though every word hit him with precise and devastating clarity. Brother. Vegetative state. A slow, aching pulse of guilt stirred inside him, not the sharp stab of shock, but a low, persistent throb, bleeding from an old wound. Julian pulled Isla's file from the stack and held it in his hands. The attached photo revealed a young woman with deep, steady eyes, her face calm and still as a windless lake. No anger. No accusation. Only a serenity so complete it made it hard for him to breathe. "Leave this file," Julian said, voice low and unreadable. "Arrange a direct interview." The secretary scribbled a note saying nothing more. Decisions made by Julian Carter were to be executed, not questioned. But inside him, nothing felt clean or decisive. He closed the file, his thumb brushing along the edge of the paper, mindlessly tracing it. The thin border was sharp enough to bite into his skin, leaving faint, invisible lines. Inside his mind, a battle raged noiselessly. Why her? Why now? Was this fate handing him a chance at redemption? Or just another desperate attempt to outrun that helplessness that still gnawed at him every night? Julian rose, Isla's file still in hand, and walked toward the towering glass window that overlooked the city, now drowning in morning fog. The faint light reflected his silhouette, blurred, almost dissolving into the gray sky beyond. Maybe, if he helped her somehow, he could claw back a fragment of the peace he had lost. Maybe, if he tended to the life she fought so fiercely for, he could silence, even briefly, the hollow emptiness In his own heart, he could not rewrite the past, he could not erase his sins, but perhaps, just perhaps. Julian lowered his gaze to the file, the name Isla Bennett blurred behind the lenses of his glasses, as if he himself could not bear to look directly at the truths it unearthed. He tightened his grip on the folder, clutching it like a man grabbing at a single straw in the eye of a storm. Maybe, Julian whispered so quietly only he could hear, helping her. Maybe then I'll sleep. A soft gust rattled the windows, setting the heavy drapes into a slow, uncertain sway, like the hesitant breath of someone stirring the eaves. Dust of memories long buried. Julian turned, placed Isla's file carefully into a private drawer, one no one else was allowed to open. He knew, from this moment on, nothing would remain as simple as contracts and signatures. He had awakened, a memory, and once again he was about to step into a journey, not to conquer, but to atone. The interview room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Late morning sunlight slipped through the blinds, painting long, pale streaks across the dark wooden floor. Julian Carter sat motionless at the head of the table, hands loosely clasped, an open file lying in front of him like a ritual he no longer believed in. But today, he wasn't reading. His gaze was fixed on the door, on the woman stepping quietly inside. Isla Bennett. She wore a plain white blouse, dark jeans, and scuffed sneakers. Nothing polished, nothing performative. She closed the door behind her with a muted click and moved toward the chair across from him with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned how not to disturb the world around her. Julian lifted his eyes for the first time, a brief, sharp glance. She didn't lower her head in embarrassment, didn't stare at him in nervous awe like so many applicants before her. Isla simply stood there, composed and still, like a thin beam of light cutting through the heaviness of the room. He gestured toward the chair, a motion so economical it was almost invisible. She sat with her back straight, hands resting lightly on her lap. She didn't seek approval. She didn't plead for pity. Only a steady, unshakable quiet emanated from her slight frame. Julian glanced down at the file again, more to give his hands something to do. He knew every line already. Her experience with elder care, her nursing certification, her short but sincere letters of recommendation. "We need someone who's committed," Julian said, his voice low and measured, reading the words like a script he no longer believed in. "The work isn't easy. My grandmother values her privacy. She doesn't tolerate fuss." Isla gave a small nod. "I understand." Her voice was soft and husky, warm without the saccharine sweetness of someone trying too hard to please. Julian tapped a finger against the table, a familiar tick to anchor his drifting focus. "You have experience with fully dependent patients." "Yes," Isla replied, "my grandmother and my brother." A brief silence fell between them. The file hadn't mentioned it, that her brother was in a vegetative state, but Isla said it with a kind of plain acceptance, stripped of embellishment or self-pity. Something tightened in Julian's chest, a small, sharp constriction he refused to show. "We require flexible hours," he said, his voice dropping a shade. "Some nights, some weekends." "I can arrange that," Isla answered, her gaze steady. Silence thickened again, heavy as mist. Julian didn't rush to fill it. He studied Isla the way a man might study an unfamiliar horizon. Subtle movements, the way she didn't fidget, didn't bite her lip. She wasn't defensive, but she wasn't offering up easy doors either. Finally, Julian gave a slight nod. The decision had been made the moment she walked through the door. "Very well," he said. "You can start tomorrow." Isla nodded, unsurprised, unexcited, simply accepting, as if she had long ago stopped expecting anything to come easily. As she rose, the hem of her white blouse fluttered in the whisper of air from the overhead vent, a fragile ripple, yet somehow unbreakable. "Ela," Julianne said as she reached the door. She paused, turning slightly, the muted light catching the contours of her cheekbones, the depths of her dark, solemn eyes. "I'm here to care for her," Isla said quietly, as if she already knew the question, hovering on his lips. "Not to save anyone." Julian froze, a barely perceptible pause, but enough to know, deep inside, that she had unsettled something in him. The door clicked softly shut behind her, leaving the room filled with the damp scent of wood, the dimming light, and something unfamiliar, a tiny crack in the fortress he had spent a lifetime building. He slumped back into the chair, his hand reaching almost instinctively for the loosened knot of his tie. A slow, uncomfortable churn stirred inside him, something too elusive to name. Anxiety, hope, dread. A stranger had walked into his carefully walled-off world, and for the first time in a very long while, Julian wasn't sure he could control what came next. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who change everything. Have you ever met someone like that? If you have, share your story with us below. And if you want to follow Julian's unfolding journey, don't forget to like this post. What he's about to discover will reach places deep inside us all. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, painting soft ribbons of light across the thick carpet. The sprawling living room, so often vast and hollow, today felt strangely alive, not with noise, but with the quiet unfolding of small, tender acts. Julian stood leaning against the doorway of his office, one hand buried in his pocket, his gaze fixed on the living room he usually avoided. Isla Bennett was kneeling by the armchair, where his frail grandmother dozed, a dushy-wishy wisp of a woman wrapped in sleep. Every movement Isla made was deliberate, unhurried. She tucked a light scarf gently around the old woman's neck, her hands careful, almost reverent, as though afraid of disturbing a dream too delicate to survive the waking world. Her small hands radiated a steadiness, a tenderness Julian realized he had never seen in anyone around him. He held his breath without meaning to. Isla adjusted the footstool, then leaned over and clicked on the old radio perched on the shelf. A soft, mechanical click, and then a thread of sound unfurled into the room, an old jazz tune, wordless and gentle, as fragile and steady as early morning rain. She sat across from his grandmother without touching her phone, without glancing at a clock. She simply sat, her eyes half closed to the music, stealing occasional glances at the woman she watched over, as if attuning herself to every rise and fall of a shallow breath. Julian didn't know why he couldn't look away. All his life care had been transactional. Contracts, wages, timetables, obligations. People busied themselves around the sick, but no one had ever simply been there. Not like this. A full presence. A silence rich with meaning. Julian shifted but didn't move forward. He was afraid that if he stepped into that fragile orbit, he would break it, like a clumsy hand shattering something precious in a museum. The radio hummed into a deeper, slower song. Isla reached out and took his grandmother's hand, her fingers stroking over the knobby joints with such gentleness that Julian felt it like a ripple in his own chest. No one had ever taught him about moments like this. Not in textbooks, not in business seminars, not in billion-dollar negotiations. He had learned how to win, how to dominate. But he had never learned how to stay, how to simply be with another soul, without fixing, without fleeing. His grandmother stirred slightly, murmuring in her sleep. Isla smiled, a small, secret smile not meant for anyone else to see. Julian tightened his hand into a fist in his pocket. A strange, disorienting feeling welled up inside him. Was it shame? Awe? A hollow, aching loneliness? In that moment, he felt like a stranger in his own home, a man peering through glass at a life he had never truly touched. The music faded into silence, leaving the room vast and open. Isla stood, folding the scarf with slow, careful strokes, smoothing the wrinkles with the patience one gives to time-worn things. Julian turned away before she could see him, retreating into the shadowed hallway. He leaned his back against the cool wall, closed his eyes. "You don't have to say anything," the voice in his head whispered. "You just have to be there." And he wondered, had he ever truly been there? For anyone? Or had his life been a series of transactions and conquests, each one leaving him more hollow than the last? Julian opened his eyes, staring up at the distant ceiling where the late light clung in thin, uncertain wisps. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, after all this time, he could still learn to stay, to care, to love without speaking a word. And maybe, just maybe, everything began with something as small and fragile as this. The faint strains of music still hung in the air, an old, weathered melody, drifting like small waves lapping gently at the shores of a far-off memory. Julian remained where he was, leaning against the hallway wall, washed in the soft glow of the evening lights, his hand loosely clenched inside his pocket. The house was so still that he could hear the slow pull of his own breath, blending with the ghost of music wafting in from the living room. And then, threading through that fragile quiet, came another sound, a voice. It wasn't strong, it wasn't polished, it was raw, trembling slightly like a petal brushing against the wind, rising and falling with the melody of Rise playing on the battered old radio. Isla. Julian stilled, something sharp and unfamiliar catching. Deep inside him, brushing against the place he had long ago convinced himself was stone. Her voice cracked here and there, imperfect and human, yet filled with something he couldn't quite name, something achingly pure and utterly without pretense. He moved closer, slowly, cautiously, as if one wrong step might shatter the delicate magic unfolding in the house. Through the narrow gap of the door, he saw Isla sitting cross-legged at the foot of his grandmother's chair. She wasn't looking at the radio, or her watch, or the world outside. She simply sat there, hands folded loosely, and sang, not for applause, not for acknowledgement, maybe not even for his grandmother, maybe for herself, or for someone she still carried inside her heart. The words of Rise floated between them. When the night is cold and you feel alone, rise. Her voice faltered slightly on the high notes, but she didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She sang with the soft, stubborn courage of someone who loved without expecting anything in return. Between verses, Isla leaned closer, whispering, as if sharing a secret meant only for the woman sleeping before her. My brother loved this song too. He can't hear now. He can't speak. But I still sing to him. Every day." Her voice broke gently at the end. Not from anger, not from despair, but from the tender gravity of carrying grief so long it had become a part of her breath. Julian gripped the edge of the wall, the sharp edges of his control cutting into his palms. Isla kept singing, her voice never rising above the room's hush. She sang for a boy who might never hear her again. She sang for a bond that even silence could not sever. She sang because sometimes love means refusing to let go, even when the whole world already has. Julian closed his eyes, and behind the darkness of his lids, the image returned, uninvited, undeniable. The boy sprawled on the rain-slick curb. The youth stamped out too, soon. The mother's voiceless scream. He had spent years trying to drown it all out, with work, with victories, with carefully controlled ambition. But here, in the soft tide of a simple song, Isla had undone every fortress he had built around his guilt. When Julian opened his eyes, he saw himself clearly for the first time. How small he was, how selfish, how long he had been running. Inside that faded room drenched in pale sunset, Isla sang for someone who could not hear, and Julian, standing outside the door, heard every note like a blade drawn clean through the tender, broken heart he had buried for so long. The song ended. Isla remained where she was, still stroking the gnarled hand resting in the armchair. She didn't wait for praise. She didn't need an audience. She hadn't sung to be heard. She had sung because love demanded nothing in return. Julian took a step back, feeling like an intruder at a sacred altar he had no right to approach. He turned away, retreating into the dim hallway where the light could not follow. Each step weighed heavy, as though he were carrying every unspoken regret on his back. In the shadowed silence, he whispered to himself, "A vow meant for no one else. Even if no one hears me, I will still sing, because love doesn't need an answer." It was not a promise to Isla, not to anyone else. It was the first fragile promise he had ever made to the forgotten, trembling part of himself. The high-rise apartment was bathed in the faint bluish haze of the sleeping city below. Julian stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a hollow, echoing snap, swallowed by the cavernous emptiness. He didn't turn on the lights. He let the darkness drape over him like a heavy, suffocating coat. Everything was still. Only the distant hum of engines rose from the streets far below, a sound Julian had never noticed before, now pounding through his chest like a slow, insistent drum. He walked straight to the sound system in the corner of the living room. His hands usually precise, steady, mechanical, trembled slightly as they hovered over the buttons, a single, hesitant touch, and the silence he had wrapped himself in was torn open by music. Rise, the song Isla had sung. The melody, at first thin and tentative, swelled into the room, filling every hollow space, curling into every untouched corner with a tenderness so sharp it was almost cruel. Julian stood frozen. No defenses. No armor. When the voice rose, gentle and unyielding, it flooded his body like a tide, dragging him under into the very memories he had spent years burying. Every lyric was a blade, cutting deeper. Rise, when you're broken. Rise, though your heart aches. Julian's vision blurred. He gasped, but it wasn't enough. The air in his lungs felt thick, soured, pressing down until he stumbled, bracing himself against the arm of the sofa. But the fortress he had spent a lifetime building cracked and crumbled all at once. He let himself collapse onto the cold wooden floor. His knees hit first, then his palms, the shock of it shooting up his bones, raw and merciless. He stayed there, slumped against the side of the couch, arms limp, like a soldier fallen from his horse, too broken to fight any longer. The music pulsed around him in slow, aching waves, relentless as the sea eroding stone. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, but the images surged forward. The boy lying sprawled across the wet curb, the twisted frame of a bicycle, the bright red stain blossoming across the concrete, the mother's silent scream, her world ending in the rain. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't explain it away. A hoarse whisper escaped his lips, almost inaudible. "I stole the song from a life." He shuddered, not from cold, but from the crushing force of a truth he could no longer outrun. It hadn't been just an accident, not just a momentary lapse. He had stolen a future, a boy's unwritten songs, a family's fragile, irreplaceable hopes. And Julian Carter, no matter how many buildings he raised, no matter how many empires he conquered, could never give back that single, stolen breath. The wooden floor beneath his hands was brutally, mercilessly real, a reminder of the emptiness he had forged with his own hands. The song began to fade, its final notes dissolving like mist into the room's vast silence. Julian dropped his head against his knees, letting the tremors rack through him, too shattered even to weep properly. There were no loud sobs, no cries for forgiveness, only the broken sound of breathing, torn and ragged, leaking from a man who had finally crumbled under the weight of all he had refused to carry. It was a judgment not handed down by any court. It was a sorrow without end. And in that darkness, for the first time, Julian understood. The greatest punishment had never been the judgment of others. It was the verdict his own heart delivered. Each time that song began to play. The apartment remained cloaked in broken patches of city light. The old radio had fallen silent, leaving only the sound of night wind threading its way through the cracked window frames. Julian sat motionless on the floor, his head resting against the side of the couch. The physical exhaustion gnawed at his muscles, but his mind burned, terrifyingly awake, as if his body had given up, but his heart, raw and stripped bare, refused to stop raging inside him. How long had he been sitting there? An hour? 2? He didn't know. Time in this moment had lost all meaning. Slowly, like a man relearning how to stand after a storm, Julian pushed himself upright. Each step toward his desk was heavy, his legs dragging through an invisible mire. His fingers skimmed the surface of the desk until they found a silver fountain pen, the only thing he had kept from his father, long gone now. He pulled a blank sheet of paper from the drawer and laid it flat against the cold wood. He sat down, inhaling deeply. The nib touched the page and his hand trembled, not from weakness, not from chill, but from the simple terror of what he was about to do. For the first time in his life, Julian Carter was preparing to write down a truth he had never dared to admit, to anyone, not even to himself. He began. No drafts, no corrections, no strategy. Each word bled onto the paper like a slow, clean cut, each line slicing deeper. Isla, I don't know where to begin, and maybe there's no right way to begin. I'm the one who hit your brother that night. I was there. I saw. I didn't run away, but I never found the courage to face it. The words spilled out, steady and quiet, as if pulled from a wound that had never been stitched shut. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I know I have no right to it. I'm writing because, finally, I have to face the truth. I've lived in fear, in silence, in pretense, that time would erode the pain, that it would all eventually fade. But it never faded. It only sank deeper until I no longer recognized the man I had become. Meeting you, seeing you care for others with hands that ask for nothing in return, I realized I had never truly faced the damage I left behind. If nothing else, I need you to know this. I remember that night. I remember your brother's face. I remember your mother's eyes. I remember the rain, every drop, every strangled breath. Julian paused, drawing in a breath so deep it ached inside his ribs. The ink bloomed into the fibers of the paper, bleeding out in delicate veins, like a wound that could never be scrubbed clean. He wrote the final lines, his hand gripping, the pen as though clinging to the edge of something vast and crumbling. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only asking to be responsible, to face it, even if it's too late. He folded the letter carefully, each movement deliberate, as if dressing a wound that could only be protected, not healed. No envelope. No seal, just a single folded sheet resting, quietly on the desk. Small, fragile, yet heavier than any billion-dollar contract he had ever signed. Julian pressed his forehead to the back of his hand and closed his eyes. The cold sweat clinging to his back felt like the talons of something unseen, something ancient. He didn't know what Isla would do when she read it. Maybe she would hate him. Maybe she would say nothing. Maybe she would simply walk away, leaving only the faintest echo of her presence behind. But this time, Julian knew. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He wasn't seeking redemption. He was, at last, standing still in the wreckage of his own making, facing the darkest corner of his soul without flinching. And when the first thread of morning light slipped through the gap in the curtains, casting a thin golden line across the floor, Julian was still there. Beside the folded letter. Beside the fragile beginning. Not to salvage his image, not to absolve his guilt, but simply, finally, to be a man worthy of being called human. The room still carried the faint warmth of morning light as Julian folded the letter and slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt. No envelope, no name, just a thin sheet of paper, yet it weighed as heavily as his entire life pressed into a few trembling lines. He rose slowly, moving with the unsteady care of a man recovering from a long, fevered sickness. His footsteps were heavy against the hallway's wooden floor, each step illuminated by the pale sweep of the golden wall lamps. The villa was unusually silent for a morning. The housekeeper, the staff, everyone, it seemed, understood that some mornings must be left undisturbed. Julian's pace was slow, his every step sharp and clear against the floorboards, like the beat of a heart pulled too tight. His hand clenched the letter, in his pocket so tightly that the knuckles blanched white. He wasn't sure he had the strength to keep moving, but he knew, if he turned back now, he would never find the courage again. At the end of the hallway, just before the living room, he saw Isla, She was standing by the window, changing the water in a vase of fresh flowers. A simple thing, ordinary. And yet, to Julian, it shimmered with a strange, almost sacred beauty. The quiet, patient mending of a world he had only ever known how to break. She didn't turn when she heard his footsteps. She simply continued selecting stems, trimming them with gentle precision. Her white blouse framed her narrow but steady frame, the soft lines of her body illuminated by the morning light behind her. Julian stopped a few steps away, and he realized this wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about easing his guilt. It wasn't about redemption. It was about one thing only. Finally, at last, refusing to run from himself, he pulled the letter from his pocket. His hand shook slightly in the open air, his body recognizing, more than his mind did, how monumental this small act truly was. "Isla," he said, his voice raw, rasping. She turned. The sunlight caught the edges of her hair, weaving a faint halo around her. Her eyes, deep and calm, met his, without fear, without hatred, only patient, steady waiting. Julian extended the letter. The space between them stretched taut. Isla did not rush to take it. She watched him carefully, as if giving him one last chance to turn back. But Julian didn't turn back. He felt every thunderous beat of his heart hammering in his ears as her fingers finally reached out and brushed his, the briefest, softest contact, and took the letter from his hand. The moment their skin touched, a silent tremor shot through him. Not romance, not hope, but the unbearable truth of what he was offering. Everything raw, broken, human inside him, laid bare. Isla held the letter, her gaze flickering over his face, searching, perhaps, for honesty, for remorse, or simply for the shape of the truth. The room plunged into a silence so complete it seemed to hum. Somewhere, faintly, an old radio murmured a song with no words, a melody slipping into the stillness like water seeping into dry earth. Julian stood firm, no longer hiding the tremble in his hand, the crack in his voice. He spoke, low and rough, carving each word into the air like a vow. I was there. I saw. And for the rest of my life, I will not forget. He didn't know when Isla would read the letter, didn't know what she would think, didn't know if she would stay, or if she would vanish from his life as quietly as she had entered. But this time, he wasn't running. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't retreating behind walls of power and success. He had stood naked before the truth. A soldier laying down his final shield. Isla said nothing. She simply folded the letter once more, tucked it into her hand, and walked away. Unhurried, unafraid, and unshaken. Julian watched her go, standing there until her figure disappeared. Around the corner of the hall, swallowed by the house's long shadows, only then did he let his shoulders sag, releasing the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. No miracle happened. No sudden peace descended. But one thing was certain. He had begun the only journey that mattered, the journey back to becoming a human being. The door had barely clicked shut behind Isla when the house seemed to sag inward, as if every breath had left with her. Julian remained standing where she had left him, his eyes fixed on the empty hallway where the hem of her white blouse had just disappeared around the corner. He didn't know how long he stood there. Only when the pins and needles gnawed at his legs did he force himself to move, his body dragging him back to the living room, a space that suddenly felt foreign, unmoored. The chair where Isla used to sit was empty. The vase she had refilled that morning still stood by the window, the delicate stems trembling slightly. In the whisper of the air conditioner, the old radio sat silent and forgotten on its shelf. Julian glanced around at the familiar furniture, the well-worn routines, and realized with aching clarity, Hila's presence, however quiet, had become part of this house, and now her absence gnawed at every corner. 3 days. Hila did not return. No text, no call, no note, just a complete unspoken vanishing, as if she had never existed within his world at all. Each morning, Julian woke earlier than usual, ears straining for the sound of soft footsteps down the hall. He listened for the whisper of fabric, the clink of a vase being adjusted, the soft thud of a chair being pulled into place. But every morning, the house answered him with nothing, but a silence as sharp as broken glass. The nurses came and went, tending to his grandmother with professional efficiency, blood pressure checks, feeding schedules, routine conversation. But something essential was missing. No one remembered to turn on the radio. No one tucked the thin blanket around his grandmother's legs with care. No one simply sat with her, not out of obligation, but because presence, Ethiu itself, was an act of love. Each day, Julian passed by the dining table, the long, dark table where now only emptiness sat across from him. The chair Hila had chosen, near the window where the light pooled most gently, was abandoned. That empty chair seemed to anchor his gaze whenever he entered the room. Breakfast grew cold. Coffee turned bitter. Every ritual lost its meaning. He sat there morning after morning, staring at the empty chair, half expecting, half praying that Isla would appear again, sliding into her seat with that small, unspoken grace. But she never did. Only the slow, mechanical ticking of the wall clock answered him, hammering into the cracks spiderwebbing across his heart. At night, Julian couldn't sleep. He lay in the vast bed, his eyes wide open, letting the cold seep through the half-closed curtains. Every creak of the window, every low howl of the wind through the halls made him flinch, made him hope, absurdly, for a miracle that would not come. In the darkness, he saw Isla over and over again. The way she had held the letter, the way her fingers had curled around it, steady and careful, the way her back had disappeared down the hallway, leaving him with nothing but silence. Julian wondered, had she read it? Did she hate him? Or had she simply chosen to step quietly out of his life, the same way she had once entered? He didn't know. And that, he realized, was the punishment he had earned, not through accusation, not through judgment, but through this hollow, relentless ache that gnawed at him with every passing hour. On to. The third day, Julian found himself sitting at the dining table in the late afternoon. The sunset stretching long, bruised shadows across the wood. The empty chair cast a long, thin silhouette across the floor, a crack between two worlds, the world with Isla and the world without her. He rested his forehead against his hand, his fingers drumming a soft, aimless rhythm on the table. There are some mistakes, he realized, that cannot be undone, cannot be repaired, cannot be forgiven. They can only be endured, in silence, day after day. The empty chair across from him, the chair where Isla once sat, laughing softly, folding a blanket, pouring tea, was now a mirror throwing his own ruin back at him. No accusations, no blame, only the silence. So deep, he could hear his own heart pronouncing its guilty verdict, beat by beat. Julian closed his eyes and let his shoulders fall. For the first time, he didn't fight the pain. He let it tear through him, split him wide open, let the memories crash over him in waves he couldn't stop. He no longer prayed for Isla to return. He no longer clung to the hope of miracles. He simply sat there, facing the empty chair, facing the slow, smoldering wreckage of himself. A sinner accepting the sentence only he could carry. And outside the windows, as dusk swallowed the last of the light, the house held its breath with him. Rain began to fall as night crept slowly across the icy window panes. The droplets struck the glass in soft, hollow thuds, trailing down in long, trembling rivers that blurred the faraway lights of the city, as if the whole world was weeping. Quietly, with Julian, he sat motionless before the massive window, his shoulder resting against the cold wooden frame, empty eyes staring into the smeared grayness beyond. The empty chair at the dining table remained where it always was, a silent wound, but tonight, the sharpest ache didn't belong to the present, it belonged to the past. Another rainy night, a memory that would never be cleansed. Julian closed his eyes, and in an instant, the flood came, memories tearing through every defense Hiti Suining had so carefully built. That night, the rain was merciless, drowning the streets in a heavy, gray haze. Julian drove alone, his chest tight from a brutal negotiation that had wrung him dry. He wanted only to get home, strip off the heavy suit, and drink himself into forgetting. The headlights cut through the rain like torn ribbons of light, painting twisted streaks across the slick black road. The wipers slashed back and forth, failing to keep pace with the sheets of water. An intersection loomed ahead. No lights, no signs, no reflective lines to guide him in the downpour. And then, a figure darted into the road, a boy. Thin, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to his skull, Julian slammed the brakes, every muscle, every ounce of strength thrown into that desperate act. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt, a sound that ripped straight into the core of him. Time stretched, thick and suffocating. The boy couldn't move fast enough. The car struck him. Not hard, but hard enough to crumple that small, fragile body onto the frozen ground. The sound was sickening. Not the clang of metal against metal, but something softer, heavier, devastatingly human. Julian stumbled from the car without thinking. No umbrella, no plan, just a man running, blind into the storm. The rain lashed at him, stealing his breath, clouding his vision. He dropped to his knees beside the boy. The boy's hand twitched weakly, his eyes squeezed shut, his face contorted in pain. A thin stream of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth, curling into the rainwater, staining the pavement like ink spilled from a well that could never be refilled. A window slammed open. Footsteps pounded, and then a scream. A woman. The mother. She collapsed beside her son, cradling his small broken body with shaking hands. Her voice cracking and repeating a name Julian couldn't make out over the roar of the rain. She looked up at him, not with rage, not even hatred, but with a vacant, frozen despair so deep that it hollowed the air between them. That look had scorched itself into Julian's mind, burning him from the inside out with every breath he had taken since. The police came. The ambulance. The flood of procedure and legality. Julian answered every question, gave every statement, the conclusion, an unavoidable accident, Poor visibility, slippery roads, no recklessness, no charges filed, no handcuffs, no shouted blame, only Julian, trapped in a cage of his own making, condemned by a silence heavier than any verdict could have been. He snapped his eyes open. Rain still bled down the windows in shuddering lines. He lifted a hand, pressing his fingers against the cold, wet glass. The chill clung to him, seeped into him, as if the guilt had soaked so deeply into his skin it could never be washed away. He whispered into the darkness, swallowing him whole. I tried to stop, but it wasn't fast enough. It was never fast enough. Not fast enough to stop the disaster. Not fast enough to save a life still blooming. Not fast enough to undo it, to fix it, to offer a word, any word, that might have mattered. Julian leaned his forehead against the glass, letting the icy surface blur the broken reflection of himself. He sat there, unmoving, letting the rain erase everything, the unfinished dreams, the unsaid apologies, the chances he had lost forever. The night would pass, but the wound, that wound, would never close. The morning sky wore a thin veil of gray, and the weak, wandering sunlight barely pressed through the heavy clouds. The rain had long since stopped, but the air still carried the raw, earthy scent of wet ground, and a sadness that hadn't yet dissolved. Julian sat motionless at the dining table, a cup of cold coffee cradled between his hands. He hadn't changed from the night before, hadn't slept a minute. He had only sat there, counting each hollow tick of the clock echoing through the silent house. Every so often, his eyes would flick toward the hallway, toward the front door, an unconscious reflex he could no longer control. But there was nothing. No one came. He told himself he had to get used to it, used to the emptiness, used to the truth that some doors, once closed, never opened again. And then, just as the clock nudged past 8, at the very moment Julian surrendered his last thread of hope, the doorbell rang, a soft, simple chime, but it slammed into his chest like a crack of thunder. He froze. For a long second he couldn't even breathe. He pushed himself up, legs trembling after too many hours spent still. The bell rang again, gentle, unhurried. A quiet reminder that someone was out there, waiting. Step by step, Julian crossed the living room, each movement a raw scrape across nerves frayed to the breaking point. He reached for the door handle, pausing for the briefest breath to steady himself, and then he opened it. Light spilled in from the porch, and standing there, under the damp eaves still dripping from last night's rain, was Isla. She wore the same familiar white blouse, her hair tied back neatly, her face calm, as if she had never been gone, as if no letter had ever passed between them, as if the silence of the past 3 days had been nothing more than a breath held too long. She looked at him. No smile, no anger, only the steady, bottomless stillness of her dark eyes, like a lake undisturbed by even the lightest wind. Julian parted his lips to say something, a greeting, an apology, a plea. But nothing came. The words tangled somewhere between shame and the fragile, foolish hope that had survived against all odds. Isla spoke first, her voice low and even, neither cold nor warm. My patient still needs me. The words were clean, precise, a bridge laid carefully across the vast emptiness that had opened between them. She met his eyes, drawing a line clearly in the sand. I'm not here for you. I'm here for who needs me. Julian only nodded, No explanations, no attempts to hold her, just a silent, reverent acceptance as if he had been granted a grace he had done nothing to deserve. He stepped aside. Isla walked past him into the house, her shoes leaving. Small, wet prints across the floor. Neither of them spoke. Julian watched her move down the hallway, shoulders straight, steps sure, as if the days apart had never existed at all. He stood in the open doorway for a long moment, the cool air brushing his face, scarcely daring to believe she was really there. The house itself seemed to breathe again, loosening some invisible knot that had tightened around its bones. The old radio sat silent on the shelf. The vase of flowers trembled faintly in the draft. Julian closed the door. He leaned back against the wood, closing his eyes. A part of him wanted to collapse, to sob like a child pulled from a nightmare. But he understood. This was not salvation. This was something smaller, more fragile. A second chance. A thin, precious sliver of beginning, offered not with forgiveness, but with the quiet grace of presence. He followed the faint trail of damp footprints along the floor, like a man fumbling toward light through the dark. In the bedroom, Isla was speaking softly to his grandmother, her voice low and tender, as soothing as a song that needed no words. Julian stood at the threshold. He didn't step inside. He only listened. There was still so much work ahead of him, more than he could even name. But today, Isla's return, her silent, steady presence was enough to ignite deep within him a small, flickering light, a light that was real. The house seemed to exhale a new breath when Isla stepped through the door, as if every brick, every wall, every mote of dust had been holding its breath, waiting for her return. Julian stood by the doorway, silently watching the familiar rhythm of her movements. No apologies, no explanations, and he asked for none. He simply gave a small nod when their eyes met. An unspoken acknowledgement, brief but binding, needing no words. Isla set her bag down on the chair, switched on the old radio and let a gentle, wordless melody drift into the room. Not Rise, not the song that once shattered them both, but something softer, steadier. She moved to tend to his grandmother, slipping seamlessly back into her quiet caretaking, as if the 3 days between them had never carved a hollow space. Julian made his way slowly into the kitchen, his palms damp with sweat he barely registered. He pulled 2 glasses from the cupboard, his hands moving carefully as if afraid that even the smallest noise might crack the fragile quiet hanging between them. He filled them both with water, 1 glass for himself, 1 for Isla. The faint clink as he set her glass on the table was the only invitation he dared to make. Isla glanced over, no surprise, no hesitation. She moved to the chair opposite him, settling with a stillness that filled the small kitchen like a tide coming in. The faint scent of tea drifted from somewhere nearby. Silver-gray light streamed through the window, casting the 2 of them in a soft, pale glow. 2 figures sitting opposite each other, surrounded by a silence dense with all the things they had yet to say. Julian tightened his grip around his glass. The surface of the water quivered, catching the fractured reflection of his face, worn, older, but for the first time, honest. He drew in a slow breath, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if shrugging off a weight he had carried for years. He looked up, and this time he did not look away. No more flinching, no more hiding from the light. Isla met his gaze calmly, her dark eyes steady and unblinking, like a deep well that could hold any sorrow without shattering. No blame, no demands, only presence. Full and unwavering. Julian gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. A vow without sound. His voice was rough, brittle from disuse. He paused, fumbling for the right words, but in the end, all he could offer was the simplest, truest thing he had. I don't need forgiveness. I need to become someone worthy of it. Isla said nothing. She only lifted the glass, took a small sip, an answer that needed no words. No promises were exchanged, no conditions set. Just two people, once broken, once fleeing, now sitting quietly across from each other, like two storms finally spent, finding each other in the fragile calm after the rage. Julian felt his heart slow its frantic pace. No more chasing, no more grasping for the right thing to say or do. Only one quiet, steady wish to be patient, to be kind, to rebuild, not to atone, not to erase, but to become someone different, someone who could at last step out from his own shadow. Outside, the sky remained heavy, the clouds thick and low. But here, in the small, dim kitchen, something had begun, something silent, resilient, like a tiny green shoot pushing its way through frozen ground. Night spread over the city like a heavy, suffocating quilt. The distant lights from the high-rises flickered faintly, cold and lonesome, like tiny flames adrift in a gray sea of mist. Julian stood by the balcony door, hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze heavy and still as he stared outward. Behind him, the apartment remained silent. Isla had left earlier that evening, after a long, quiet day tending to his grandmother. No unnecessary words, no requests, no demands. Just her presence, as steady and unintrusive as breath itself. Outside, the night wind slipped through the empty spaces between buildings, carrying a cold that seemed to seep straight into the bone. Julian lifted his head, looking toward the city sky. Starless. Just thick clouds and the bruised glow of artificial light, making everything feel low, heavy, airless. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to scrape the bottom of his chest. Somehow, after everything, the empire he had built, the towering real estate fortune, the undeniable power, amounted to nothing more than slabs of concrete, empty shells of ambition stacked against a hollow sky. How many years had he traded away? How many pieces of himself had he mortgaged for something that now felt so unbearably weightless? Julian wondered. If all of it vanished tomorrow, would anyone remember him? Would anyone mourn? He reached out, placing his palm against the cool glass, the city's blurred reflection merging with his own. A man with tired eyes, a face carved thinner by regrets than by time, shoulders sagging under the invisible, crushing weight of everything he could never say aloud. Beyond the window, each glowing window told its own story. Families gathering, children laughing, lovers touching hands beneath soft yellow lights, and Julian, standing here, apart, a traveler lost in the very world he had helped to erect. A whisper escaped his lips, almost drowned by the wind. I built walls, when I should have planted gardens. He had constructed fortresses, strong buildings, shrewd deals, airtight defenses, all in the name of shielding himself from pain, from loss. But in doing so, he had imprisoned himself. Brick by brick, lonely stone after lonely stone. He, closed his eyes, letting the wind rake its fingers through his hair, letting the emptiness hollow him out. Layer by layer. He thought of Isla, her hands gentle enough to catch unspoken sorrows. He thought of the boy, of dreams stillborn, of smiles that never had the chance to bloom. He thought of himself, of all that might have been different, if he had only chosen to build something else. A flash of light crossed the sky, a plane, or just a figment of his weary mind. Either way, it reminded him, journeys still moved onward, whether we caught them or not. Julian opened his eyes. The sky was still gray. The city was still cold, but inside him, something infinitesimal, small beyond words, was shifting. Not a longing for forgiveness, not a hunger for redemption, but a quieter, deeper desire to live differently, to build gardens instead of walls, even with hands scarred and clumsy from so many years of stacking stone. He turned away from the balcony. The apartment waited behind him, dim and unfinished, a blank page, still blank, still waiting, if he could find the courage to write something new. Tomorrow there would still be meetings, there would still be contracts, emails, plans, but tonight, only tonight, Julian allowed himself to take the first steps, slow, careful, toward something real, something softer, something, maybe, finally, beautiful. The study was awash in a soft, muted gold, the lamplight stretching Julian's shadow long and thin across the cold stone floor. He sat there, still as a monument, the window behind him a sheet of black glass reflecting his own blurred, silent image. Papers lay scattered across the desk, thick stacks of project documents, contracts, profit analyses, all printed in cold, precise ink. The Midtown Tower project. His pride, his ambition, and now, the heaviest stain he had ever carried. Julian's gaze skimmed the figures, the neat notes about compensations, forced evictions, relocation plans. It was all so familiar, so logical. But tonight, it felt different. Each line weighed down like a silent indictment, each paragraph pressing against his chest like a judgment he no longer needed a courtroom to hear. The night wind whistled beyond the glass, carrying with it a sound so faint it might have been imagined, a distant call. Or maybe it was simply the voice within him, Isla's voice, the boy's voice, the voice of the man he had lost somewhere along the way. Julian closed his eyes, his fingertips trailing along the edge of the folder. A thought surfaced, fragile as breath. If I can save even one person, I'll start here. He opened his eyes, and without hesitation, his hand released the file. It slid from his grip and fell to the floor, the quiet slap of paper against stone sounding louder than a demolition, louder than a lifetime's worth of ambition crumbling into dust. Julian bent down and picked up a single page, a land acquisition contract. His signature stared back at him, bold, confident, and utterly empty. He gave a small, hollow smile, set the page back on the desk. Then he reached for his phone. No hesitation, no second guessing. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name of his financial advisor, the man who had been with him through every victory, every ruthless expansion. The line rang longer than usual. Then the familiar courteous voice answered, "Julian, what can I do for you?" Julian gripped the phone tightly, his voice low and unwavering. "I want to sell Midtown Tower." There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end. long enough for Julian to hear the slight intake of breath. "I'm sorry." The question came back, tinged with disbelief. "I want it sold," Julian repeated, his words clear, deliberate. "As soon as possible. And I want all proceeds used to establish a foundation for patients in a vegetative state, nonprofit, anonymous." Silence again. But Julian didn't need approval. He didn't need permission. He had already decided. He hung up before hearing a reply, setting the phone down on the desk with a slow, firm hand. Julian leaned back in his chair, tilting his head toward the ceiling. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his shoulders lessened. Not because he had cast off responsibility, but because he had finally stopped clinging to things that no longer mattered. He turned his head, looking out into the misted expanse of the city beyond the glass. There was no triumph there anymore, no conquest, only a simple, earnest hope to leave behind something good, however small, however quiet. Not to buy redemption, not to polish his image, not to be forgiven, but simply to do what was right. He whispered into the darkness swallowing the city. "If I can save even one person, I'll start here." And he knew, even if that foundation saved just one life, even if it rekindled hope for just one soul abandoned like the boy on that rain-drenched night, it would be enough. Enough to believe that his existence had not been entirely wasted. The night wind stirred the fallen papers on the floor, flipping them over like small, fragile birds. Julian didn't gather them. He rose instead, turned his back on the wreckage of old victories, and stepped forward, slow but steady, like a man, feeling his way bare-handed out of a long, dark maze. The fountain pen in Julian's hand felt heavier than ever. He sat at the long, familiar table, the warm circle of a desk lamp casting a pale gold halo over the open documents spread before him. White pages, terms and conditions. Charter, details. Everything was ready. Everything but one thing, a signature and a name. Julian gripped the pen, his fingers tightening slightly around the cool silver barrel, his gaze settling on the bold, empty line at the top of the page. Organization name. He exhaled, long and slow, pulling the breath from somewhere deep inside where hesitation still lurked. Then, steadily, he lowered the pen to the paper and wrote, each curve and stroke deliberate. Sure. Rise Fund. Not Carter Foundation. Not anything bearing his name, his wealth, his achievements, just one simple word. Rise. To stand. To mend. To move forward. Like the song Isla had sung that rainy afternoon beside his grandmother's chair. Like the fragile but unyielding hope Isla still carried for her brother, a boy who could no longer hear, no longer respond, but who still existed inside the quiet constancy of her love. Julian set the pen down, his hand falling limply to his side. A long silence stretched through the room. No applause. No cameras flashing. No congratulatory handshakes. Only one man, one decision, and one quiet beginning. He stood, brushing his fingertips along the edge of the desk like a man steadying himself after a long illness. Through the glass wall, the city sprawled at his feet, its towers blinking like beacons in the mist. A world he had once believed he could conquer. Now he was only a small figure among endless lights, and for the first time, he didn't feel lost. Julian shrugged his jacket over his shoulder and left the office, driving through the rain-slick streets, the lamps casting soft gold across the asphalt. He pulled up in front of an old building under renovation, the one he had chosen to transform into a neurological rehabilitation center. The glass doors had been cleaned. A brand new sign hung. Suspended above the entrance, draped in a white sheet, a crew of workers was securing the final bolts. Julian stepped out of the car, hands deep in his pockets, and looked up. The workers pulled away the sheet. The floodlights caught on the new sign, revealing it in stark, simple relief. Rise. No founder's name, no slogan, no grand declarations. Just one word, plain and unyielding. A silent reminder. To rise, to live, to hope. Julian felt something clutch his chest. Not pain, not regret, but something gentler, trembling, like a new sprout breaking through frozen earth. He didn't know how many would find healing here. Maybe only a few, maybe only one. But he knew this. If even one soul found breath again, found sight again, found the strength to dream again, then everything he had lost would have meant something after all. Hila wasn't here. She didn't need to be. Julian understood. This wasn't a gift for her. It wasn't a redemption for the boy. It wasn't an apology. It was something new, something born not of guilt, but of hope. He whispered into the hush of the cooling night, not to atone, but to offer hope. A breeze stirred the sign, making the metal hum softly in the quiet. And Julian stood there, alone under the streetlights, his hands loose at his sides, but for the first time, there was no darkness in him. Only light. Thin, fragile, but enduring. A light called Rise. The early morning draped a thin veil of mist over the streets, blurring the world into something that looked half dream, half memory. Julian stepped out of the notary's office, the signed Midtown Tower sale agreement tucked neatly under his arm. The papers sealed, the signatures inked, and the heavy chains of the past finally unfastened. He paused at the top of the steps, gripping the file tighter, and drew a deep, steadying breath as if trying to inhale the quiet revolution taking place inside his own ribs. No cheers, no handshakes, no flashing cameras. Just the soft light of dawn stretching slowly across the skyline, washing the city in hues of gold and gray. Julian moved slowly toward his car parked down the block, his footsteps tapping lightly against the pavement, each step marking a quiet beat in the beginning of something new. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, the file of commitment papers resting on the passenger side like a solemn companion. Outside, the city was waking. The first scattered horns, the clatter of market stalls being set up, the rumble of rolling metal shutters, ordinary sounds. But today, to Julian, they rose into the morning air like a slow, familiar symphony. He turned the key in the ignition, but didn't pull away. Not yet. Not with the rushed urgency that had once driven every day, days where time had been a ladder to climb, a race to win. He sat there, drumming his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, his gaze trailing. Far beyond the glass windshield, he wasn't thinking of what he had lost anymore. He wasn't blaming what could never be undone. There was only now, quiet, complete, and humming faintly with life. Julian smiled, a small smile, the first true one in years, a smile that didn't carry the weight of exhaustion behind it. He shifted gears, easing the car down the misty street, heading toward the temporary offices of Rise Fund, where volunteers were gathering, sorting the first stacks of paperwork, drafting the first small dreams. No one there knew he was behind it, and he intended to keep it that way. No plaques, no speeches, no name carved into stone. Rise Fund was never meant to glorify him. It was a gift for those still fighting, for breath, for families clinging to hope, for lives suspended in waiting. He parked across the street from the modest 3-story building, freshly renovated, its windows shining clean, the word Rise hanging quiet and proud above the door. No fanfare, no red carpets, just young volunteers in simple shirts, arms filled with files, their faces alight with a clear, determined energy. Julian didn't get out. He simply sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching, feeling the soft pressure of the commitment papers still waiting, at his side, a vow not to anyone else but to himself. He knew the road ahead would be long. There would be weariness. There would be doubt. But now, he had something solid to anchor him. Not someone else's forgiveness, but a small, fierce seed of belief sprouting within his own heart. He leaned back in the seat, eyes half closed, listening to the city breathing all around him. A single shaft of sunlight filtered through the trees lining the street, catching the windshield, scattering golden reflections across the stack of papers beside him. Julian watched the light dance there and whispered to himself, "Sometimes, the right thing doesn't need to be seen." And he smiled again, soft as a breath, the silent beginning of a different kind of life. Across the street, the doors to Rise Fund stood open, and small dreams were beginning to fill the rooms inside. And inside the car, Julian Carter, the man who once built the highest walls, was quietly learning how to plant gardens instead. The soles of Julian's black shoes sank slightly into the damp earth left behind by last night's rain. Before him, the old warehouse loomed, its faded brick walls and towering, dust-choked windows worn thin by years of neglect. A forgotten place like the lives Rise Fund had set out to reach, and now, under the muted light of a gray morning, it would begin a new journey. Julian tightened his grip around the ring of keys in his hand. Simple keys, but heavy with meaning. He moved toward the large battered door, the peeling paint exposing veins of rust underneath. Sliding a key into the lock, he twisted gently. The bolt shifted with a soft, weary groan. A sound like a long-held breath finally exhaled. The door creaked open. A wave of musty air swept out. The smell of dust and damp and time long past. Julian didn't flinch. He stepped inside, letting the pale, reluctant daylight illuminate the cracked tile floor and the webbed, crumbling walls. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, vast, broken, and yet brimming with possibility. He paused at the center of the room, the keys dangling loosely from his hand, feeling the chill seeping through the gaps and cracks that would one day be mended. Images began to take shape in his mind. Sunlit therapy rooms, clean white beds where patients would lie not forgotten, but fiercely cared for, small gardens where families could gather, free of the mechanical coldness of sterile hospitals. No indifference, no bureaucratic apathy, only compassion. And a chance, however small, for those the world had too easily abandoned. Julian moved slowly down the main hallway, each step measured, each breath deliberate, as though his own heartbeat was setting the tempo. Every empty room, every crumbling wall he passed, he saw not as a ruin, but as a canvas, not as an investment, but as a beginning. When he reached the end of the hall, he stopped before a large, open room. Light spilled in through a broken window, flooding the space with a muted silver glow. This would be the heart of Rise Fund, the first rehabilitation room, the place where dreams paused in stillness might quietly stir. Awake again. He imagined Isla, her face when she sang Rise to his grandmother. He imagined the families, the patients who had waited, endured, hoping, now given a place to hold on to. No miracles, no grand promises, just care, patience, and opportunity, small, fragile, but enough to light even the dimmest corners of a tired soul. Julian leaned, back against the cold wall, letting his shoulders fall slack. The keyring in his hand jingled softly, the metallic chime rising into the stillness like a quiet hymn. He understood now. Each key he held wasn't just for unlocking doors. Every time he handed over a key, to a patient, to a family, to a fragile new hope, he was gently unlocking something inside himself as well. He whispered a quiet vow offered into the dust and morning light. Every door we open saves a heart. Outside, the sun finally broke through the heavy cloud cover, slender rays slicing across the old windows. Light drifted inside, striking the cracked floors, sketching a faint, shimmering path, a map to something new. Julian stepped from the room, the keys still clutched firmly in his hand. He would mend each wall, replace each door, fill each room with light. He didn't need his name on a plaque. He didn't need anyone to remember where it began. It was enough to know doors would open, lives would be given another chance, and from this forgotten place hope would grow, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully, like the quiet light of a morning not yet fully born. The small Rise Fund office still smelled faintly of fresh paint, its furniture half assembled, its air humming with the quiet expectancy of beginnings. Outside the window, the late-day sun slanted low, spilling a honeyed light across the empty floor. Julian sat alone at an old wooden desk, a blank sheet of paper laid carefully before him. In his hand, the silver fountain pen, the only relic he had carried from his former life, warmed slowly beneath his touch. He stared at the paper for a long time, not because he didn't know what to write, but because, for the first time in his life, he wanted every word he put down to be real, not to cover, not to redeem, not to be forgiven, only to tell the truth. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks in the windows, stirring the last ribbons of daylight. No one was rushing him. No one was waiting for him. Only the silence. Vast, understanding, patient. Julian drew in a slow breath, lowered his pen, and began. To your family. I don't know if I have the right to address you. I don't know if these words will ever reach you, or if they should. But I'm writing them anyway. Because some things, if left unsaid, will remain unseen forever. He paused, the pen still resting lightly against the page, his fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of reverence for a grief he could never mend. I was there that night, in the rain. I was the one who wasn't fast enough, wasn't careful enough, wasn't enough to protect a dream still too tender to stand alone. I have carried that night inside me all these years. Not because I deserve pity, but because I know Some mistakes are beyond the reach of time to heal. I am not asking for forgiveness. I don't dare hope for that. I only ask for this, to begin again, with what is right, with whatever small good I am still capable of offering. If one day someone finds healing, dares to dream again, rises from a place they thought they would never escape, please know that in every breath they take, a part of my heart goes with them. Not to forget, but to remember. I ask only for the chance to begin again. Julian laid the pen down. He did not sign his name. No address, no mark to trace it back to him. He folded the letter into 3 precise sections, smoothing the creases carefully. From his jacket, he pulled a plain white envelope. No recipient scrawled across it. No sender. Just a blank envelope, a quiet offering, asking nothing in return. He rose, stepping out into the street. The road ahead was already lit by the early flicker of streetlights, the city beginning to hum softly in the settling dark. Julian walked toward the nearest mailbox. An old, blue one, chipped and rusted at the edges, standing sentry at the corner where countless anonymous letters had come and gone like whispered prayers. He paused in front of it. The envelope felt light in his hand, and yet it carried a weight, deeper than anything he had ever built or conquered. In that moment, the city noise receded, leaving only the thick, living sound of his own heart. Without ceremony, without hesitation, Julian slipped the letter into the mailbox. The soft thunk it made as it fell was like a breath released after years of holding it in. He closed his eyes and exhaled, a long, ragged breath that emptied every corner of regret he had carried like armor. The letter was gone. No reply needed. No absolution required. It was enough to know, somewhere, a seed had been planted, silent, humble, but pulsing with hope. Julian opened his eyes and looked up. The clouds were thinning, and the first faint stars prickled into view, fragile and enduring. And for the first time, Julian Carter did not feel alone in the journey he had chosen to walk. That morning, the sky was startlingly clear, the early sunlight sweeping like a gentle brushstroke across rooftops and treetops alike. A soft breeze stirred the courtyard in front of the newly renovated building, where the Rise Fund's sign now hung, gleaming, steady under the newborn light. The opening ceremony was quiet, exactly as Julian had wished. No loud banners, no endless speeches, just people, families who had once lost hope, eyes carrying stories left untold, gathered silently in the modest square before the main entrance. Julian chose a seat tucked away under the trees, a quiet corner where he could watch without drawing attention. Gray jacket, plain shirt, no tie. No one here knew he was the one who had built Rise Fund, and he needed it that way. His gaze drifted toward the makeshift stage where a small group of new staff hurried to set the final touches. There would be no microphone, no podium, only a small speaker placed neatly at the center, ready to play a single song. Julian sat with his hand gripping the edge of his chair, his heart pounding against his ribs, fierce and wild. He wasn't nervous about being seen. No one would recognize him. It was something deeper. The knowledge that what was about to unfold would mark a turn in his life from which there would be no return. A young nurse stepped to the center, bowed slightly to the crowd, and pressed play. Music filled the courtyard. The song Julian had once played. Alone in the hollow echo of his apartment, The song that had once caught him at the edge of a darkness too wide to cross. Rise. The melody drifted outward, soft and pure, like a tender hand brushing gently across old, sleeping wounds. It was not loud. It was not commanding. It simply was. Quiet. Steady. Julian closed his eyes, letting the sound seep into every broken place inside him. And then, something shifted. A small stir of voices rippled through the gathered crowd. Julian's eyes snapped open. Near the front, a boy lay on a special hospital bed, wheeled carefully into the courtyard. A boy, they said, had been in a vegetative state for years, beyond the reach of the world. And as Rise played, sweet and unwavering, the boy's lips moved, not a twitch, not an involuntary reflex, but rhythm. The rhythm of the song. The rhythm of hope. The nurse closest to him gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Beside the boy, a woman, his mother surely, gripped his frail hand, her entire body shaking with unspeakable emotion. Julian sat frozen. He couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe the life flaring up so quietly, so fiercely, right before his eyes. The music wrapped around the boy, around the entire courtyard, steady and sure, like the heartbeat of something newly reborn. For a moment, the whole world blurred, and all Julian could see was the boy's mending lips, the peace smoothing across his young face beneath the gentle dawn. And in that single, fragile moment, all the guilt, all the bitterness, all the years of silent self-punishment within Julian, they dissolved, not forgiven, not erased, but transformed, from darkness to light, from sorrow to resurrection. Tears welled and spilled, freely from Julian's eyes, no shame, no restraint. They fell like a soft rain after a drought too long endured. He pressed a hand lightly to his chest, feeling his heart hammer not with regret anymore, but with the fierce, humbling knowledge that perhaps, finally, he had done something right. He whispered, meant only for the boy, for Isla, for the trembling soul inside himself. One heart still beating is enough for a lifetime of repentance. The morning drifted on, the music fading into a ragged round of applause. But for Julian, something infinitely more profound had begun. Not the journey of a man broken by guilt, but the journey of a man who, at last, knew how to stand up. For the small, the good, the stubbornly beautiful things still left in the world. The applause had faded, and the courtyard of Rise Fund slowly returned to its gentle, natural hush. Morning birds chirped softly from the trees, their songs weaving into the light breeze that stirred the open space, cool and alive. Julian remained where he was, tucked away in his shadowed corner, hands clasped loosely in his lap, eyes still fixed on the small hospital bed where the boy had, only moments ago, moved his lips to the music. And then, quietly, wordlessly, something even more miraculous happened. Under the soft, pale light of the early day, the boy's mouth lifted at the corners, shaping the faintest, most fragile smile. It was barely there, a breath of a smile, a mark drawn lightly on wet sand. But to Julian, it shimmered like a miracle. He tightened, his hands, his chest stilling for a heartbeat before opening up to a new feeling. Something clear, pure, and achingly simple. Peace. Not the fierce rush of remorse, not the sharp sting of regret, but a sweet, quiet surrender, like rain soaking deep into dry, cracked earth after a long, merciless drought. For the first time in years, Julian let his own mouth lift into a smile. Small. Unforced. True, he didn't try to control it. He didn't feel he needed to earn it. He simply let himself float with the slow current of rebirth that seemed to flow through the air. His gaze shifted, away from the boy. And that's when he saw her, Isla. She stood at a distance behind the gathering crowd, alone. She didn't push forward, she didn't seek attention, she simply watched. The way someone watches when they've long since accepted that their place is at the quiet edges of life's big moments. Their eyes met across the open space, no words, no signals, no need. Between them stretched a bridge of silent understanding. Stronger, deeper than anything words could build. Julian dipped his head slightly, a silent thank you sent her way. Thank you for showing him that even the most worn-out souls could find their way back. Thank you for not rescuing him, but for letting him rescue himself. Isla answered with the faintest nod, then turned and walked slowly toward the building, disappearing among the small knots of people exchanging hopeful glances. Julian stayed seated a moment longer, letting the thin sunlight warm his face. He closed his eyes, allowing every feeling to soak deep into his bones. No rush, no force, just living, fully, quietly, in this moment, a moment he knew, with more certainty than he had ever felt. Before meant he had truly come home to himself. Not Julian Carter, the cold strategist, the master of control, the fugitive from grief. Just Julian, a man, ordinary, human, brave enough to fall, brave enough to stand, brave enough to smile. He whispered to the breeze, "Sometimes hope begins with a silent smile." And he knew, from this day on, he would keep walking forward, slowly, peacefully, gratefully, into whatever light waited for him. The music of Rise lingered in the air, a thin veil of sound draping itself over everything, tender and unseen. Julian sat at the very back row, hands clasped tightly in his lap, head bowed, gaze locked onto the empty space before him. His heart beat slowly now, no longer a wild, ragged thing, but a deep, aching stillness. He closed his eyes, letting the melody seep into his veins, into the worn fabric of his being, washing away the last stubborn traces of regret, guilt, and all the apologies he had never dared to voice. And then, amidst the music and the steady breathing of the people around him, he heard a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. A chair, sliding quietly. A breath beside him. Julian opened his eyes and turned his head, slowly. Isla. She slipped into the seat beside him, as silent as a leaf settling onto a still lake. She didn't look at him. She didn't say a word. She was simply there. The empty chair next to him, the one he'd thought would stay vacant forever, was no longer empty. Not to condemn. Not to demand. Not to grant absolution. Simply to be. Julian felt something tighten around his throat, a taut, invisible thread drawing breath from his lungs. He dropped his head, clasped his hands tighter on his knees, knuckles blanching white. His eyes stung, not from pain, but from something warmer, softer, impossibly fragile, blooming in the deepest cracks of his heart. Isla remained still. She left just enough space between them not to touch him, but close enough for her presence to reach him, steady and sure. The music of Rise wound its way around them, drawing quiet circles in the air, weaving two battered, silent souls into the same tender stillness. Julian drew a long, careful breath and lifted his face to the pale morning light. No apologies needed, no promises made. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken in the quiet between them. Isla leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, hands laced together, a posture of ease, of quiet resilience. Julian mirrored her, both of them sitting in parallel silence, two weary winds finally finding a place to rest. A soft breeze slipped through the courtyard, nudging the Rise Fund banner so that it swayed gently overhead. The sun was climbing now, spilling a delicate wash of gold over the worn stone steps before them. Julian stole a glance at Isla. Her face was calm, unbitter, undefended. There was only one thing left between them. Presence. A quiet decision to stay. No explanations needed. No reasons demanded. Julian whispered, not aloud but in the private chamber of his heart, the words he knew she would understand without hearing. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't need words. It just needs someone to stay. Isla didn't turn. She didn't need to. She stayed. And for Julian, that was everything. He let his shoulders relax, leaning gently into the back of his chair. The pain inside him didn't vanish, but it was held now, wrapped in something soft and real, like an old, familiar blanket pulled over him on a cold night. No grand miracles. No dramatic redemption. Just one person choosing to stay, and another finding himself again because of it. And so, in the small courtyard flooded with the first clean light of morning, the empty chair was no longer empty. It was filled, quietly, steadily, forever. The last echoes of Rise lingered in the cool air as a tender stillness settled over the courtyard. People slowly rose from their seats, exchanging silent nods, handshakes held a little longer than usual. No need for many words. Julian and Isla remained seated, side by side, unmoving, silent, yet full. A soft breeze stirred the hem of Isla's jacket, and a small leaf drifted down from the trees above, landing gently between them. Julian lowered his gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, unguarded smile. And then, from somewhere inside the building, a small sound. Click. The old radio, the same one Isla had once used to fill the house with music and warmth, flickered to life. A tiny crackle, a heartbeat of static, and then the familiar chords spilled softly into the morning. Rise. No one had touched it. No one had planned for it to play. It simply woke up at the right time, in the right place, as if to whisper, nothing is truly lost. Some things are only waiting for us to return. Julian turned his head toward the doorway. Isla did too. Inside the half-renovated room, the little radio poured its song into the empty spaces, weaving through every corner, every broken heart, every breath that trembled with feelings too deep for names. Julian watched as Isla rose. She took a few slow steps toward the threshold, where the early sun slanted in through. Tall, dusty windows, painting soft rivers of gold across the old stone floor. She stopped before the radio. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She simply placed a hand over her heart, where her pulse beat slow and steady. Such a small gesture, so simple. Yet, it held everything: memory, acceptance, and life. Julian watched, his chest tightening, not with grief, but with something else: gratitude. Deep, unspeakable gratitude for Isla's choice to stay, for the quiet courage it took to remain, for the gift she had given him, the belief that even broken hearts could find new rhythms. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a smile that needed no effort now. A real smile, unforced, effortless. The music touched him like invisible hands, lifting the splintered pieces of his soul, mending them not with grand gestures, but with tenderness. The song wasn't long, but to Julian, every note was a step forward, a reaching hand, a whisper. "It's not too late. It's never too late." Isla turned back toward him. The light caught in her hair, forming a soft halo, a small human kind of crown. Her eyes found his, and this time, no shyness, no fear. Only acknowledgement. We have survived the longest. Winters, and we are still here. Julian nodded once. No speeches, no promises, just one small nod, enough to hold 1,000 words. He whispered, just for himself, for Isla, for every battered part of him. "No one needs to forgive me anymore, because I've forgiven myself." And in that moment, as the final soaring note of the song filled the room, light bathed the space, not blinding, not overwhelming, just enough. Enough to warm every crack and crevice. Julian closed his eyes. One journey had ended. Another, slower, deeper, more enduring, had just begun. No more walls, only gardens now, waiting to be tended. Thank you for being part of this story with us. Maybe, for each of us, there are wounds that never completely fade. But there will always be moments when even the smallest gesture, a single kind glance, is enough to help us begin again, and forgive ourselves. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes just staying quietly beside each other is enough.